Ladies and gentlemen, Rear Admiral Hayes, 30 years of distinguished service. The general's voice carried across the hall, clear and final. Chairs scraped as men and women in uniform rose in unison, their hands snapping into crisp salutes. My eyes caught my father's in the crowd. He sat frozen fork, halfway to his mouth, the smirk he'd worn at breakfast that morning, gone like smoke. Just hours before, over scrambled eggs and too much toast, he'd leaned back in his chair and chuckled. I bet she retired early. She never had the grit. Now the room belonged to me, and silence belonged to him. It was the second Sunday of May, warm enough in Wharton, Texas, that the air carried the smell of cut grass and faint diesel from the grain trucks that rolled past our street. We were packed into my father's kitchen like we had been for decades, wood-paneled walls, faded curtains, a formica table worn smooth by elbows and coffee rings. My father, Frank Hayes, sat at the head. 80 years old, wiry as ever, his thinning hair slicked back with the same care he'd given it back when he was a foreman at the refinery. He still wore his starched button-down shirts on Sunday's collar, sharp enough to cut paper. He believed in appearances and making sure the neighbors saw a man who hadn't slipped. Across from him sat my brother Michael in his navy whites. Michael loved ceremony. His shoes shined bright enough to blind name tag, lined perfectly with the crease of his shirt. He flew in from San Diego for what he called a strategic summit, though anyone could tell it was little more than defense contractors shaking hands with Navy brass. Still at the table, he made it sound like history itself turned on his briefings. Beside him was his wife Lauren, the picture of politeness. She laughed at his stories the same way she had laughed for 20 years, high-rehearsed, a little too eager. And then there was me, Dana Hayes, 48, quiet one. I sat on the far side, blazer still on, even though the kitchen was too warm. I wasn't in uniform, at least not yet. My father buttered his toast with slow, deliberate strokes, as if what he was about to say needed the rhythm of a knife spreading margarine. He smirked and glanced at me sideways. I bet she retired early, he said, voice low, but loud enough to cut through the chatter. She never had the grit. Michael chuckled, tossing a grape into his mouth like it was the punchline of a joke. Probably true, Dad. She always liked the quiet life. Virginia suits her. The table went still for a moment. Lauren gave me a polite smile, one of those don't take it personal looks. My father shook his head, sipping his coffee. No shame in it, sweetheart. You had the brains, sure, but not the drive for command. I didn't answer. I rarely did. That was my job in the family, the one who carried the plates, who made the coffee, but never drank it hot, because I was clearing the table first. The one who didn't correct them when they got it wrong. I stirred my tea, the spoon clinking soft against the ceramic. Still working, I said finally. Michael laughed, leaning back his ribbons, catching the light. Huh, must be nice. No reports at 2 a.m., no brass breathing down your neck. He raised his glass of orange juice like a toast. To early retirement. They laughed again. I smiled politely, but something sharp pressed beneath my ribs, cold and familiar. It wasn't anger. It was something older, like the echo of a bruise that never fully faded. The conversation rolled on, back to Michael's stories, last-minute resupply ops he saved single-handedly, near misses with foreign ships, the kind of tales that got nods from my father. Each time, Dad leaned back, nodding like a king watching his heir speak. Now, that's command presence, he said, proudly, eyes shining at Michael. I let the words pass over me like I always had. But inside I was already somewhere else. Arlington, the Pentagon, a sealed folder waiting on my desk, the 2 silver stars resting in a velvet case on my shelf. I excused myself after the plates were cleared. Michael kept talking. Lauren laughed. Dad lit another cigarette out back. I slipped out into the Texas sun, the air heavy with the smell of diesel and honeysuckle, and drove back toward Houston to catch my flight east. In the rearview mirror, I saw my father on the porch, leaning on the railing, cigarette glowing between his fingers. He wasn't waving goodbye. He never did. That night back in Arlington, the streets were quiet. My apartment was 3 blocks from the Pentagon, a modest brick building that smelled of old carpet and heating oil. Inside my office was bare. No plaques, no family photos. Just a bookshelf with one frame, a black and white shot of my first squad, all of us grinning after a classified op no one ever mentioned again. I booted up my secure terminal. The screen flickered lines of encrypted messages scrolling like rain. At the top, confidential operation. Triton Command, briefing, 0930 EST. Auditorium, C. Command transfer prepared. Rear Admiral D. Hayes, full honors. I leaned back, the glow of the monitor casting pale light across the room. The stars on the shelf caught its silver, flashing like tiny beacons. Not pinned yet, just waiting. Waiting for the day someone in my family would look me in the eye and realize who I'd become. When I think of beginnings, I don't think of banners or band music. I think of the metal folding chairs at the Wharton VFW Hall, the coffee that tasted like it had been reheated 3 times, and the old men in ball caps embroidered with ships' names that only they remembered. I was 17, clearing paper plates into a black trash bag, while my father held court near the trophy case, telling the men about Michael's arm, how at 12 he could throw a tight spiral down the length of the Wharton High field. Someone clapped his back and said, "That boy's headed somewhere." Dad beamed. When they asked what I was up to, he said, "Dana's got brains. Computers, probably." He meant it as praise. It landed like a lid. That summer, I took the bus to Houston to sit for my congressional interview. The air in the federal building smelled like carpet glue and rain. I'd ironed my skirt so stiff it creaked when I sat palms damp against the manila folder, with my transcripts and varsity letters no one cared about. The panel asked about leadership. I told them the truth, I'd never been captain, but when the captain cried in the locker room after a loss, I was the one who sat next to her and mapped the next practice on the back of a grocery receipt. I said I was good at plans. I didn't say I was good at disappearing inside them. The blue folder with the nomination came a month later. My father read the letter and cleared his throat. "Annapolis is no joke," he said like a warning. "Not for everyone." He squeezed my shoulder. "But hey, if it doesn't fit, there's no shame coming home." He set the letter down like it might break. Plebe summer was a wet wall of heat-salt air, pushing off the Severn and into our lungs until we forgot we had lungs at all. We ran, we braced, we shouted, and somewhere inside the shouting was the silence of learning where to put your eyes. When the world demanded you look everywhere at once, I wrote home in the 5 minutes they called liberty. My father wrote back terse notes: "Eat, sleep when you can. Proud, not yet." My mother had been gone 5 years by then. Her absence felt like a closed window you never opened because you weren't sure what would come in. During seamanship, I loved the way a chart turned a blank ocean into a map you could hold. In electrical engineering, the equations snapped together like Lego bricks. At 0700 calculus, my pencil left small grooves in the paper where I pressed too hard. I wasn't top of the class. I wasn't bottom. I was the steady line no one noticed unless it failed. A visiting officer named Commander Patel taught a seminar on cryptology and networks. He spoke in a voice like gravel and told us that modern war was as much about the messages you never let through as the bullets you did. After class, I asked to see the old cipher wheels in the display case. He unlocked the cabinet and set one in my hands. It was heavier than I thought, a circle of brass that smelled faintly of oil and time. "Some people love noise," he said. "They want to be heard. Some of us love the hinge, the part that swings the door and never gets its name on the deed." I didn't say anything, but something settled inside me like a keystone. Summer crews put me aboard a destroyer out of Norfolk, the Atlantic, slapping the hull like a firm, constant hand. On midwatch, the mess deck coffee was burnt and perfect, the air metallic and humming with machines that didn't care about sleep. A chief with forearms like fence posts taught me to listen to a room who was pretending not to be tired, who was 2 minutes from a mistake. "Presence isn't volume, ma'am," he said. "It's reliability." I wrote that in a notebook and underlined it twice. At graduation, Michael flew in and shook hands with every officer within reach, shining like a brass rail in July sun. Dad wore his good hat and told anyone who would listen that his son was headed to flight school. When an uncle asked where I was going, I said, Corey Station, Pensacola, Information Warfare. He blinked, then smiled the way people do when they didn't catch it and don't want to ask twice. Computers, Dad translated. Someone nodded in relief. Pensacola had the smell of jet fuel and salt cicadas sawing the air in the medians. We learned to trace patterns that didn't want to be traced, traffic that hid inside other traffic signals that wore masks. The fluorescent lights hummed like a second set of lungs overhead, and the classroom clocks seemed to skip, jerking forward in hard inches. Some students chased the thrill of the red screen the moment an alert went loud. I chased the quieter thing, how to make the red never appear at all. Nights I ran along Bayfront Parkway, the water black as tar and smooth as an oath. Old men in folding chairs flicked ash into the dark and waved when I passed. The palms clicked like loose change. When the air cooled, I thought of the Wharton VFW and the smell of stale beer and aftershave, and I wondered if any of those men would have called what I was doing service if they couldn't see it stitched on a sleeve. We rotated through billets that didn't have names you could put on a resume. I learned the taste of stale breath behind a mask in a skiff, the way a long night makes a keyboard sticky, the soft pain between your eyes when you've stared at a screen long enough to know that what's wrong is small and real and right there if you stop wanting it to be big. A lieutenant with a laugh like a cough taught me how not to chase ghosts. If you need the dragon, you'll paint one, he said, tapping a graph. Don't. On leave, I flew home for the 4th of July parade. Wharton did it the same every year. Kids on bikes with red, white, and blue streamers, the high school band sweating through Sousa, a flatbed with hay bales and a homemade banner that said, God bless America, in letters that leaned like they'd had a long day. Dad stood near the courthouse, hand over his heart when the colors passed, chin lifted just enough to tell the world he understood sacrifice. Michael waved from the back of a convertible, tossing mini Tootsie Rolls like a candidate. Someone shouted, "We love you, Lieutenant." He raised both hands like he was landing a jet. After we ate barbecue in the park, paper plates bent under brisket, Dad sat with his buddies and told them Michael's squadron number. When they turned to me, I said I work nights. Keeping our folks safe in a way you'll never have to worry about, I said, and meant it. Dad laughed. She's modest, he told them. One day, she'll settle down. Government contractor. Good hours. I smiled because there wasn't a decent reply that didn't turn into a fight, and I had learned early how to avoid fights you couldn't win. Orders took me next to Hawaii, then to D.C., not as a star, but as a hinge. In windowless rooms, we built fences no one would ever see, and when storms came, we kept the lights on without anybody knowing the wind had risen. I started carrying a small moleskin and writing down names of sailors who showed up when no one was looking, petty officers who fixed things before an officer knew they were broken. Presence as reliability. I made it a habit to write thank you notes. I never mailed words that stayed in my pocket a week and then went into a drawer. It wasn't modesty. It was a ledger for my self-proof that the quiet mattered. Dad called sometimes on Sundays. He'd ask if I'd watched the game. He'd say Michael was on TV at some ceremony, looked sharp. He'd ask if I was eating enough. Before he hung up, he'd say, "You still happy, sweetheart?" And I'd say yes, because I was. Because happiness wasn't applause for me. It was a clean terminal at 0300 and a graph that settled down like a horse after the storm passes. It was knowing someone out there slept through the night because we did not. There are people who build their lives like parades, loud, bright, easy to follow. I learned to build mine like the power grid. Quiet, steady, the kind of thing you only notice when it fails. Some careers are stitched in ceremony. Some careers are built in silence. Mine preferred the second kind. The first time I walked into what we called the black room, I thought I'd stepped into a cave. No windows, no clocks, just the low hum of servers stacked like steel coffins against the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too cold, washing everyone into the same shade of gray. A sign outside the heavy door read, "Authorized personnel only. No devices, no exceptions." I swiped my badge, typed in a code I'd memorized in the hotel bathroom mirror, and pushed through. Inside, half a dozen sailors in khakis, hunched over monitors that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. Graphs and codes scrolled like rain across black screens. The air was stale, the kind that made your throat dry. Someone handed me a headset. "Welcome to Shadows," he said. His name tag read, Wells. That was the beginning of the next 20 years. Not tours with flags and brass bands. Not carrier decks with television crews filming jets screaming into the sky. My world was silence encryption anomalies that didn't want to be found. We didn't fire weapons. We found things before weapons needed to be fired. There was a night in Okinawa I'll never forget. I was 34, working under a cover title that sounded like it belonged in the Department of Agriculture. The rain hammered the barracks so hard the walls seemed to shiver. A freighter flagged for humanitarian aid had gone dark off Taiwan. Everyone assumed a busted radio. I didn't. Something in the ping pattern looked wrong off by less than a second. I traced it for hours, my eyes burning pencil tapping against the desk until I nearly broke the lead. At 0200, I escalated it. Got pushback from a commander who thought I was paranoid. I escalated again. By dawn, we had drones overhead. Pirates had just started unloading crates. No shots fired, no headlines, no congressional hearings. We intercepted, recovered everything. Lives saved. When it was over, the fleet commander got the medal. I got a handshake in a hallway, the kind you forget before lunch, but in my pocket, folded tight, was the log. I kept the exact timestamp where I'd seen the shift. Proof, if only to myself, that I hadn't imagined it. That was the rhythm. Over and over. An Iranian sub surfaced where it shouldn't have. A Chinese trawler broadcast signals on frequencies it had no business touching. A server farm in Estonia suddenly spiked traffic at 3 a.m. We were the ones who saw it first. The ones who sent the quiet alerts, red-tagged the folders, kept the wrong things from becoming front-page news. My father never heard about those nights. At Thanksgiving, he'd ask, "So you still doing computer work?" And I'd say yes. Michael would jump in with a story about landing a jet in crosswinds or talking down a sailor drunk on Liberty. Everyone laughed, clapped his back. I passed the gravy. In our family, presence was measured in volume, and I'd never been loud. I learned to live in that shadow space. I stopped expecting applause and started keeping ledgers. Not of medals, I had almost none, but of names. Sailors who listened when I said something didn't add up. Officers who trusted me enough to act without proof. A chief who caught me staring too long at a frozen screen and slid a cup of coffee my way without a word. I carried their names in a small notebook, my secret roll call of the people who understood that silence could be power. There were moments, though, when the weight of being unseen pressed down harder than usual. One night in Arlington, I left the Pentagon past midnight. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like someone pressed pause on the world. I walked past the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The wall stretched black and endless under the dim lights, the names etched deep and silent. I stood there for a long time, my reflection mingling with thousands of carved letters. No medals, no parades, just names that outlived noise. I touched the cold stone and wondered if someday, when my own career ended, there would be anything left of me beyond a few words in a sealed folder. Michael called around that time. His voice was loud, even through the static. "We've got another ceremony coming up," he said. "Dad's flying in. I'll make sure you get a ticket." I laughed softly. "Michael, you know I don't." "Don't what?" "Don't like the spotlight. You should try it sometime. Feels good." He meant well. He always did in his own way. But when I hung up, I stared at my apartment walls bare, except for that one photo of my squad grinning in a place no one could ever admit we'd been. And I realized something. I didn't hate Michael for the spotlight. I didn't hate Dad for clapping louder for him. What I hated was the assumption that because I worked in silence, my work didn't exist. Golden suns never ask about the shadows they cast. They just assume the people in them like it that way. So I leaned harder into the silence. At 37, I was briefing joint commands behind doors sealed thick enough to block radio waves. At 40, I was running a small cell out of D.C., coordinating between agencies that didn't like to talk to each other. At 42, I was trusted enough to sign off on cyber interference protocols that prevented 3 collisions in contested waters. No one outside a handful of suits would ever know my name. But I knew, and the sailors who slept through the night because the radar stayed clear, they knew even if they never knew me. There's a phrase I kept in my pocket all those years. Some careers are made in the light, others are built in silence. Mine was the second kind. And for a long time, I thought that meant my father would never understand. Wharton, Texas was the kind of place where people kept their windows open at night and still left keys under doormats. When I came home for holidays, I noticed that everyone seemed to know Michael's schedule before I did. Folks at the diner would ask me, "When's your brother back from deployment?" as if I were his secretary, not his sister. Michael loved it. He always had. He'd walk into Mabel's Cafe downtown, order a slice of pecan pie, and somehow the whole place would pause to hear about his latest adventure at sea. He told stories with his hands waving like he was conducting an orchestra, painting himself into the center of every tale. And people believed him because he believed himself. Dad believed him most of all. One Christmas, Michael had just made commander. The whole family crammed into Dad's living room, the tree leaning because one of the legs was shorter than the others, the smell of cedar and cigarette smoke mixing with pumpkin pie. Michael stood by the mantel in uniform, even though it was December 24th. "Storm rolled in off Guam," he said, gesturing toward the ceiling like the storm might come through the roof. "Waves taller than the house. Whole supply chain about to fold. But I got the team through. We made the drop, kept the lights on for half the Pacific." Uncle Joe whistled low. "That's leadership right there." Dad beamed. He poured Michael another bourbon. "That's my boy." Then Uncle Joe turned to me. "And what about you? Dana, what are you up to these days?" I smiled as I always did. Operational planning. They nodded politely, but their eyes slid back to Michael. My father didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to. The truth was, I'd just come off a string of operations where a misread signal could have triggered international conflict. But I couldn't say that at the Christmas table in Wharton, Texas. So I passed the mashed potatoes instead. Lauren, my sister-in-law, leaned close while clearing dishes. "You should talk more, Dana," she whispered. "Michael's always so proud of you." I almost laughed. Proud Michael thought of me like a backup generator, useful when the lights flickered, but otherwise invisible. It wasn't malice. Michael didn't mean to belittle me. He genuinely thought the story he told about me was flattering. Dana's the smartest logistics brain I know. She checks my math, keeps me honest. He said it at a family reunion. Once glass raised high, everyone laughed, including me, but inside something cracked. Because that was really how he saw me. A footnote, a sidekick, someone whose worth was measured by how much I could prop him up. At the VFW hall, Dad introduced him as Commander Hayes, my son. When it was my turn, he'd say, "This is Dana, works in computers." Computers! As if I were fixing printers in a strip mall. I stopped correcting him after the first few years. The truth was classified anyway, and it wasn't worth the argument. But every time he said it, something cold lodged deeper under my ribs. One summer, Michael came back for the 4th of July parade. Wharton always made a show of it. Kids on decorated bikes, the high school band stumbling through Sousa, fire trucks blasting sirens that rattled windows. Dad stood at the courthouse steps, hand over heart when the colors passed. Michael in uniform waved from the back of a convertible, tossing candy to the kids. Someone shouted, "We love you, Commander." And he raised both arms like he just won an election. Afterward, we gathered in the park for barbecue. Smoke from brisket pits curled into the humid air, and people lined up for paper plates sagging with potato salad. Dad introduced Michael to everyone who came by. When they asked about me, I said, "Still working nights." One man squinted, trying to remember. "Weren't you in the Navy too?" I smiled. "Still am." He chuckled, patting my arm. "Well, thank you for your service." I knew he didn't mean it the way he meant it for Michael. His words were polite, perfunctory, already forgotten, as he turned to hear another of my brother's tales. That night, alone in my father's old guest room, I stared at the ceiling fan, spinning slow circles. The laughter from downstairs still echoed in my ears. I thought of the sealed files back in Arlington, the ones that would never see daylight. Files with my name on them. Files that proved beyond doubt that I wasn't a footnote. But here in Wharton, Texas, I was just Dana, the quiet daughter, the one who never made waves. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd chosen this path, the path of silence, that I didn't need their recognition. But sometimes when the house settled at night and the cicadas droned outside, I wondered how long a person could live unseen before even she began to doubt she was really there. Michael's star rose higher with each passing year, lieutenant commander, then full commander. Dad bragged at church, at the feed store, at the ball games. Folks clapped his back and said, "Frank, you raised him right." When they mentioned me, Dad would say, "Dana helps out with the technical side. Not much for the spotlight." And I let him, because in my family presence was measured in volume. And I had spent my life learning the power of silence. There are moments that change nothing on the outside, but change everything inside you. They don't come with fireworks or brass bands. They come in the hum of servers at 3 a.m, in a decision no one sees, but that shifts the balance of the world an inch toward safety. I had a handful of those moments. None of them ever made the Wharton paper, but they are the reason I kept showing up long after most people would have burned out. The first came in Yokosuka, Japan. I was 34, embedded under a civilian cover that sounded like logistics consulting. We sat in a bunker carved into the side of a hill, the concrete walls sweating in the summer heat, fans rattling like they might fall apart. A freighter carrying aid had gone silent in contested waters. Everyone shrugged, probably a broken radio, they said. But I stared at the transmission logs, the tiny gaps in the timestamps off by less than a second. It didn't smell like an accident. I pushed it up the chain, got brushed off, pushed again. My voice was steady, but my palms sweated into the cheap government-issue keyboard. By the time we scrambled drones, pirates had just started lowering cargo into skiffs. We intercepted without firing a shot. Supplies saved, crew safe. The incident never made the news. The fleet commander who signed the papers got his picture in a frame. I got a handshake in a hallway, and a note slipped into a file marked classified. I didn't complain. I wrote the date and time in my notebook and underlined it twice. Proof for myself. The second came 2 years later at the Pentagon. Midnight shift. The office smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. A Chinese trawler was broadcasting on frequencies it shouldn't have touched. My gut said it was a scout. I flagged it, but the watch officer hesitated. "It's just fishing," he muttered. "No," I said quietly. "It's not." We tracked it. Turned out the fishermen were mapping shipping lanes for a foreign Navy exercise. By catching it early, we rerouted supply ships, and what could have been a confrontation at sea vanished like smoke. The officer who signed the reroute orders got a commendation. I got another line in my ledger. The third came in Arlington, Operation Sable Current, a name no one outside a locked conference room will ever hear. We intercepted an unflagged submarine sliding too close to Okinawan waters, weapons primed. By manipulating sonar data, we fed them a false echo trail. They chased shadows into their own trap and backed off without ever knowing how close they'd been. 12 sailors slept in their bunks that night instead of floating in the dark. General Harlan called me after. His voice was gravel low and certain. "You've spent your life preventing wars, Hayes. It's time we let you lead the next one if it comes." That was the first time anyone above me had said it out loud. That what I did mattered. That the silence I'd lived in for decades wasn't absence. It was armor. Meanwhile, back in Wharton, nothing had changed. Dad bragged about Michael's promotions. The VFW put his picture on the wall. At the Christmas table, Michael toasted, "To Dana, the smartest logistics brain I know." Keeps me honest. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but inside something hardened. Not hate. Hate is hot, consuming. This was colder. It was the quiet recognition that my family might never see me the way strangers at the Pentagon did. I kept working anyway. I built teams, trained young officers, left fingerprints on strategies that would never bear my name. My specialty became what I called disaster aversion, keeping the bad thing from ever happening in the first place. That meant no headlines, no fanfare, just the knowledge that somewhere, someone slept soundly because we stayed awake. I trained myself to stop wanting applause. Instead, I started keeping a list of sailors I'd mentored. People who could think in the dark, people who would make decisions with no cameras around. That became my legacy even if no one outside the building knew it. But even armor can feel heavy. One night, I left the Pentagon late, the parking lot slick with rain. I drove past the Lincoln Memorial, the stone glowing pale under the floodlights. Tourists were gone, just the sound of tires hissing on wet pavement. I pulled over and walked to the Vietnam Wall. The granite was cold polished, so smooth that my reflection blurred into the names. 58,000 men and women, their silence carved deeper than mine. I traced a finger over the letters and thought, maybe that's all any of us get. A name on a wall, a line in a file. Proof that we lived even if no one clapped when we did. The next morning, an envelope arrived at my desk. Sealed. Stamped with red. Operation Triton. Briefing in 4 days. Assume command. Full honors. The words sat heavy in my hands. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the assignment wasn't hidden. It would be public. And I knew exactly who would be in that room. Michael, my father, all the people who had smiled politely while brushing me aside. This time, there would be no mistaking who I was. The summons came on a Tuesday, tucked inside a plain envelope with edges sharp enough to slice skin. My office in Arlington was silent except for the low whir of the HVAC. I slid it open with the edge of my Pentagon badge and slid the papers out. Operation Triton, Command Briefing, 0930, East, May 17th Auditorium. C. Rear Admiral D. Hayes to assume leadership, full honors, uniform required. I sat back in my chair. For a long moment, the words didn't move. They didn't even feel real. 30 years of silence, 30 years of being mistaken for retired or forgotten, and now here it was in black ink public command. I went straight to General Harlan's office. He'd been my shadow mentor for years, a man with a face carved like stone, and a voice like gravel dragged across asphalt. His door was open, but his assistant gave me a nod before I stepped in. He was seated at a desk stacked with folders that looked identical to mine, classified, sealed, waiting. He didn't stand when I entered, just looked up with eyes that had seen too much and given away too little. "Admiral," he said, nodding toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." I did. He slid a thin folder across the desk. Triton isn't just another exercise. It's joint, multinational, cyber, sea, air, and satellite. The kind of thing where one mistake gets replayed on screens in 5 different languages. I opened the folder. Maps, charts, lines of code. A list of partner nations. Logistics so sprawling my eyes watered just reading it. "You'll be the face," he said. "The one they salute, the one the press quotes. No more shadows." My throat felt dry. "Why me?" Harlan leaned back. His chair creaked. "Because you've been holding the line for years without asking for credit. Because you see patterns no one else does. And because it's time, the world knows it." I didn't answer. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and slid it across to me. I didn't drink it. "Your brother will be there," he added. Of course he would. Michael lived for podiums. He'd probably already practiced his grin in the mirror. Harlan's gaze was steady. "Problem." "No, sir," I said, keeping my voice even. "Good." He tapped the folder once. "When I hand you that microphone, I don't want modesty. I don't want deflection. I want presence. Every officer in that room should know exactly who is in command and why." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You've shaped battlefields from 1,000 miles away. Now let them see the scalpel." The words landed heavier than any metal I'd ever held. I stood folder in hand. He extended his hand across the desk. "Congratulations, Admiral." I took it. My grip was steady, my voice even. "Thank you, sir." That night, back at my apartment, I opened the closet where I kept a cloth garment bag zipped shut for years. Inside was my dress uniform, navy blue, crisp, never worn in public with the 2 stars. I laid it across the bed, smoothing the fabric with the same care I'd use to press a child's hair back before school. Then I unlatched the small velvet case I kept locked in my desk drawer. 2 silver stars gleamed inside untouched. My hands didn't shake as I pinned them on, but my breath caught at the small metallic click. Not ceremony, not applause. Just the sound of work, 27 years of it, finally allowed to speak. I stood in the mirror, adjusting the line of my collar. The reflection looking back at me wasn't the quiet sister or the forgotten daughter. It was the Admiral. The morning after I walked the halls of the Pentagon with the folder tucked under my arm. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Security guards nodded as I passed. I'd walked these halls 100 times before, but never like this. When I reached the secure conference room, Harlan was waiting. The walls were bare, the windows, fake the lights too bright. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Triton is full spectrum," he said once I sat. "Our adversaries are running weapons along the South China Sea corridor. They've got state support thinly disguised. We need precision, no missteps." He tapped the folder. "You've built your whole career for this. Quietly. Perfectly. Don't start doubting it now." I nodded once. "Understood." "Good," he said, leaning back. "And Admiral, your family will be in the room. Your father, your brother. Be ready." Family. That word landed heavier than the maps, heavier than the strategy. My father, the man who smirked at the Sunday table saying I'd retired early. Michael, the golden son who thought I'd been a sidekick all these years. I pictured their faces when Harlan announced my name. Not for spite, but for truth. For the first time in 3 decades, there would be no shrug, no dismissive laugh. Just recognition whether they liked it or not. I left the Pentagon that night in silence. The city hummed with traffic. The Potomac reflected the lights like a sheet of steel. I walked past the Lincoln Memorial, the statue, staring out with calm authority, and wondered if he'd felt the same years of silence than one moment when the world finally listened. At home, I hung the uniform back in its bag. The stars stayed pinned, waiting. Waiting for May 17th. The morning of May 17th dawned gray over Arlington, the kind of sky that looks like someone pulled a bedsheet too tight across the world. I dressed in silence. The cloth of my uniform was stiff, the silver stars catching the weak light from the window. When I buttoned the jacket and checked the line of the collar, I felt the weight of 3 decades pressed down, not as a burden, but as an anchor. The drive to the Pentagon was short. The guard at the gate saluted sharply when he saw my ID. I nodded, parked underground, and took the elevator up. Each floor hummed with fluorescent light and muted conversations. My shoes clicked against the tile, the sound steady, measured. Auditorium C was already buzzing. Rows of uniforms filled the tiered seats, Navy, Marines, Air Force. NATO representatives in suits whispered in the corners. The air smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, the kind of sterile scent that clings to places built for seriousness. From the wings, I could see the stage. Michael was already out there, crisp in his whites, his presence filling the room the way it always did. He gestured toward a giant screen pointing at readiness graphs, his voice smooth and confident. "Our teams have run 5 coordination drills in the past 6 months," he said. "We are sharp prepared, eager to support whoever takes lead on Triton." There was polite laughter at the phrasing. Michael smiled, just a flicker of pride pulling at his lips. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. I heard someone behind me whisper, "Is he assuming command?" Another answered, "Seems like it." I stayed in the shadows, hands clasped behind my back. Then General Harlan stepped onto the stage. The room shifted instantly. Conversation ceased. Spines straightened. His presence was different from Michael's. It wasn't charm. It was command. "I want to thank Commander Michael Hayes for his presentation." He began, his gravel voice filling the space. "The insights and readiness assessments from his team will be vital as we move forward in Pacific operations." Michael bowed his head slightly, pride twitching at the corners of his mouth. "But today's briefing is more than summary," Harlan continued. His tone dropped, pulling the room tighter. "It is transition. As tensions in the South China Sea escalate, we have activated the full scope of Operation Triton. The air thickened. Chairs creaked as men and women leaned forward. Effective immediately, Harlan said command of Triton will fall under Rear Admiral Dana Hayes. The words detonated like a silent explosion, a ripple of gasps, the sound of 100 throats catching at once. From my place in the wings, I stepped forward. Deliberate pace, shoulders back. The stars on my collar gleamed under the stage lights, undeniable. Michael turned toward Harlan, blinking. His face froze as though his internal gears had jammed mid-spin. A strangled half-laugh caught in his throat. He turned again slowly and saw me. I walked to the center of the stage. Harlan saluted. "Admiral," he said, offering me the podium. I returned the salute, then took the microphone. The room was utterly still, the silence so deep I could hear the faint buzz of the lights overhead. "Good morning," I began. My voice was steady calm. "As of Oro 900 today, I have assumed operational command of Triton." Dozens of eyes locked on me. I met them row by row. "Our primary objective is not provocation. It is precision. We will operate under a layered strategy, forward surveillance information, disruption, and full tactical readiness. This will be a hybrid theater, kinetic and digital. There will be no room for confusion, only clarity." Heads nodded, pens scratched on notepads. "My command style is simple," I continued. "I expect excellence, and I deliver trust in return. Some of you know my name, some of you don't. That is the reality of shadow service. But moving forward, I paused. Letting the silence work for me, you'll see me." Then it happened. The first row of officers rose to their feet. Uniforms straightened, boots clicked. Then the second row. Then the third. A wave moving up the tiers, deliberate and unanimous. Hundreds of officers, NATO reps, sailors, Marines, all standing. Salutes snapped. Crisp the air filled with the rustle of fabric and the collective weight of recognition. I returned it slow and precise. And in the front row, I saw him, my father. His cigarette-stained fingers twitched against his knees. His mouth hung open just slightly, as though he'd forgotten how to form words. The smirk that had lived on his face at the Sunday table was gone, replaced by something rawer. He sat, frozen, silent eyes, locked on the 2 stars gleaming on my collar. Beside him, Michael had not stood. His hands gripped his pen, so tight it dropped and clattered against the floor. His jaw flexed. His eyes red, shocked met mine. And for the first time in our lives, his ignorance ran out of breath before I did. I finished the briefing with calm precision. When I stepped back, Harlan nodded, once approval in the set of his jaw. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was measured, respectful, the kind that carries more weight than noise ever could. As I walked off the stage, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The silence in my father's seat told me everything. The applause faded into the buzz of conversations, papers shuffling chairs, scraping against the auditorium floor. Officers filed out in clusters, some whispering, some nodding with deliberate respect. NATO observers compared notes, their pens still scratching long after I stepped from the podium. I stood in the wings, the uniform stiff on my shoulders, the stars heavier than metal should be. My breath was steady, though the air felt thick with heat, and something more vindication, maybe. Michael was still seated when I glanced back. He hadn't risen with the others. His pen lay abandoned on the floor, his jaw tight, his eyes following me like a man watching a tide pull away. Everything he thought was secure. And my father, Frank Hayes Wharton's own retired refinery foreman, VFW regular Sunday table patriarch, hadn't moved either. He sat stone still, staring like he'd been dropped into a world where gravity shifted without warning. For the first time in my life, he didn't have a story to tell. I exited through the side corridor. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed in the narrow hallway, the sound almost louder than the applause had been. I pulled off the microphone, tucked it under my arm, and let the silence wrap around me. Then I heard it. "Dana, wait." The voice was ragged, urgent. I stopped. Michael's footsteps echoed behind me, too quick, too uneven for a man who had always walked like the world was his stage. His ribbons fluttered against his chest as he caught up his face, flushed. "You," he started, then stopped, breath catching. "You never told me." I turned my expression calm. "All these years, Michael. You never asked." He blinked like I'd struck him. "That's not fair," he said quickly. "You could have said something at Dad's table at Christmas. God, I thought you were, I don't know, retired early." The words hung between us. I repeated them flat, even. Retired early. He winced. The hallway went still again, save for the hum of the lights overhead. Michael leaned against the wall, arms folded like he was bracing himself against something heavier than concrete. His voice dropped. "Do you have any idea how that felt? Sitting there in the front row, hearing your name?" "Yes," I said. "That's exactly how I wanted it to feel." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. His face flushed deeper, his jaw working like he was chewing gravel. Then his shoulders sagged. He exhaled a long, slow breath. "Okay," he said, finally softer now. "Okay, I deserve that." He rubbed his temples, eyes downcast. "All this time I thought I was the one out front carrying the weight, doing the work. And you?" He trailed off, shaking his head. "You were just back there, quietly building something I never saw. Something I never gave you credit for." He looked up sharply, eyes glassy, almost pleading. "What exactly have you been doing all this time?" I didn't give him everything. I couldn't. Much of it would stay sealed forever. But I painted the edges of the truth. I told him about the intelligence command, the black site coordination, the nights I rerouted drones at 3 a.m. to avoid civilian casualties. I told him about the freighter off Taiwan, the false sonar that tricked a sub, the joint liaisons across oceans that never made it to press. I watched his face shift as the shape of my career took form. Not details, but enough for him to understand that my silence had not been absence. When I finished, he didn't speak. He leaned his head back against the cold cinder block wall and closed his eyes. "Damn," he whispered. Just one word, but heavy enough to land with more weight than the metals pinned to his chest. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the stars still pinned to my uniform, hanging neatly on the back of a chair. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Dad. Just one sentence. "Didn't know? I see it now. Proud of you, kid." No emojis. No fanfare. Just words that had taken a lifetime to arrive. I stared at the screen for a long time, the glow illuminating the bare walls. I didn't reply. Not yet. Some words don't need to echo right away. A week later, I was invited back to the same auditorium, not as a speaker, but as an observer. A few new captains were being pinned. Michael was one of the speakers. He stood tall, voice, practiced shaking hands with the young officers. His confidence was intact, though I noticed something new in his eyes when he glanced toward the back row where I sat quietly. At the end of the ceremony, our eyes met. For a split second, he hesitated. Then he nodded once. No grin, no bravado, just acknowledgement. And in that small gesture, quiet, honest, almost imperceptible, I saw something I'd never seen from him before. Respect. 2 weeks after the Triton briefing, I drove down to Wharton for Sunday dinner. The streets looked the same as they always had, pickup trucks, parked half on sidewalks, flags hanging limp in the heat, the old courthouse clock chiming 5 minutes late. Dad's house hadn't changed either. Same wood paneling, same crooked family photos on the wall, same scent of cigarette smoke soaked into the carpet. But when I walked in, the air felt different. At the table, Michael didn't launch into a story right away. He passed me the breadbasket without commentary. Lauren asked me about DC, not in that polite surface way, but as if she genuinely wanted to know. And Dad Frank Hayes, who had smirked for decades whenever my name came up, looked at me, cleared his throat, and asked, "How's your team doing out there in the Pacific?" Simple words, ordinary, but they landed with the weight of a lifetime. After dinner, we had pie on paper plates. My niece, 15 and full of teenage confidence, leaned across the table and asked Aunt Dana, "Is it true you command ships?" I met her eyes. "Yes," I said. "And people." She shrugged, then grinned. "That's kind of badass." I laughed a real laugh this time. Dad smiled too, not condescending, not dismissive. Just a small, proud smile that reached his tired eyes. At home in Arlington, I keep the stars in a velvet case when I'm off duty. Not out of modesty, but reverence. They don't belong to ego. They belong to every decision made at 3 in the morning when no one was watching. To every sailor who trusted me with their safety. To every night I spent in silence while others slept. They belong to the invisible hand behind stability. To the hinge, not the door. Sometimes I think back to my early days at Annapolis. Hair pulled too tight, shoulders squared too sharp, trying to make myself small enough not to draw fire, but strong enough not to break. I remember sitting in the library after lights out, tracing the names etched into brass plaques. Rear Admiral Yvonne Davis, Captain Elise Tran, Commander Harper James. Women whose names survived the silence. Back then I wondered if they were lonely. Now I understand. They weren't lonely. They were focused. And now I am one of them. Operation Triton went on to be called one of the most successful deterrence operations of the decade. No shots fired, no lives lost, just presence unmistakable. Nations paid attention, rivals backed down, and still much of it will remain locked away, another file in another sealed cabinet. But I don't need headlines, I don't need applause. I have the silence. On Thanksgiving, we took a family photo outside Dad's house. Nothing fancy, just the three of us in uniform. Michael's arm around my shoulder, my hand resting calmly at my side. When the picture printed, Dad framed it himself. He hung it above the mantel, replacing the old one of Michael shaking hands with a senator. This time, we were side by side, equal. People often say you should forgive those who doubted you. I don't think that's quite right. Forgiveness makes it sound like the wound disappears. It doesn't. What really happens is simpler: you outlive their doubt. You outwork their expectations. You carry your silence long enough that one day when they finally look up, breath caught, eyes wide, you let the truth speak for itself. No anger, no apology, just presence. And when the moment passes, you go back to work, because the line doesn't hold itself. If you've listened this far, maybe you know someone like me, someone who lived years in the shadows, holding things together quietly, never asking for thanks. Maybe it was a sister, a mother, a friend. Maybe it was you. Share this story with them. Let them know they're seen. Because the quiet ones, the ones who hold the line without applause, deserve to be honored too. Thank you for listening.